Welcome to Wired for This, a deep dive into how we think, believe, change, and connect. In this limited series, we explore the psychology of human behavior and neuroscience. What drives us forward, what holds us back, and how we navigate a world bursting with noise, contradiction, and complexity. In this episode, I'm excited to share highlights from two conversations I had, one with Dr. Jason Lodge and one with Dr. Philipp Lorenz-Spreen. We talked about how we consume, process, and share information, and how all of this is changing as our relationships with technology evolve. Jason Lodge is the director of the Learning, Instruction, and Technology Lab and professor of educational psychology in the School of Education at the University of Queensland in Australia. He explores the cognitive, metacognitive, and emotional aspects of learning, particularly in higher education and digital environments. He's also an award-winning educator and advisor to the Australian government on technology in education. Philipp Lorenz-Spreen leads the junior research group Computational Social Science within the Center Synergy of Systems at TU Dresden in Germany. He and his team study the societal impact of digitalization and how complex online discourse affects democracies worldwide. From American Scientist, I'm Celia Ford, and you're listening to Wired for This. Almost every morning, I wake up and read newsletters, mostly roundups of headlines from the day before. And almost every day, I'm surprised by what stories I actually remember. Often, they're not the most important. I asked Dr. Jason Lodge to help me understand why some information seems to stick, while other things seem to go in one ear and out the other.
One of the things that we know that is a significant bottleneck is our ability to be able to pay attention to only a certain number of things at any point in time. So that, I think, allows us a window to understand the way that these technologies are impacting. You know, what are the things that we selectively pay attention to, or what are the things that we perhaps don't? The research for decades has told us that the things that we do select to pay attention to are much more likely, obviously, to be processed because they enter into consciousness and then they enter into memory. And they're things that then impact on us in a persistent way. The way that technology's evolved is for various reasons. Some of those due to, advertising being built into these tools is really about trying to capture that selective attention.
I asked Dr. Philipp Lorenz-Spreen the same question.
Novelty and surprise are elements of information that we prefer, like where our attention guides us to, because obviously it's important to know new stuff. If there's something we already know, why should that be interesting to us? But there are other factors as well, especially if you think about the competition between information. I mean, we have the velocity, but we also have increasing competition. So there are more sources, there are more outlets that try to get our attention, and their negativity and other emotions are often something that guides our attention. There's this term negativity bias, which I think is a thing people already intuitively know for a very long time, and also psychologists have looked at. But now we see also in data that, for example, negative headlines online, they are more successful. They get produced more over time. So negativity seems to be something, as well as like emotions like outrage, often also negative emotions. And there's another factor, which is out-group, in-group feelings. That seems to be another factor that we humans are quite susceptible to, that whenever content is talking about us or them or us versus them, it can be more successful than others.
There are some more insidious ones as well, which are aligned with this idea of fluency. You know, what's easier for me to process? And that can be things like I have a particular bias in how I see the world, and I come across somebody who is saying something that aligns with that bias. That is easier for me to make sense of because I already kind of have this idea in my mind. So that's how we end up with these sorts of bubbles that people talk about, where people are only talking to each other within their bubble, and they might all have the same misconception that's underpinning their thinking. Often, we know, again, from a lot of the research, you want to really learn something deeply. Often that requires hard mental work. And often that hard mental work also comes with confusion, frustration, anxiety sometimes, depending on, what the material is that you're trying to learn. These are not things that should be avoided. These are really critical parts of the learning process.
But most of us don't have time to put that kind of mental effort towards skimming our news feeds every day. The constant fire hose of information is simply too much, and discourse shifts too quickly. Philipp's research group studies how people share information online and how public discourse evolves within social networks.
Online, we know there are millions and even billions of people being active, posting stuff, writing content, and sharing and also engaging with it. And these are usually the measure points that we have. So we have the content, so we can look at the text, which is also increasingly possible through the development of language models. But we can also look at the metadata, like the engagement, what gets a lot of likes, and how does it move through the network, like who is sharing it. And with that, we can, for example, look at time series. So we can see if there are certain terms that get a lot of traction, and then we see these trends going up and the trends going down again. But we can also look at networks where we can follow who is sharing in the network certain content and then who's resharing it. And so how does it move through the social network? These are all things that become very quantifiable now. And of course, we need computers for that. So this is all digital data that we can then process.
Back in 2019, Philipp's team used these tools to study collective attention, how long bits of cultural information circulated around social media before being forgotten.
Yeah, we were inspired by sociologists who have been talking about social acceleration before that, about this idea that technological progress speeds up our lives, makes us more efficient, but in turn, we also put more tasks in our lives and the society moves faster. And in this vicious cycle, we are basically, in a way, trapped. And we thought it would be cool to measure that and to really quantify it. So we went for various platforms. We started with Twitter. Back then, it was quite easy to get Twitter data for longer periods of time. And we did actually see that what we call public discourse here is the popularity of hashtags. The popularity of hashtags that increased quicker and also lost popularity quicker over the years. And then we thought, okay, that's a hint that there's some acceleration going on. And then we went for other data sets that some of them were also online, like Google search queries, like how quickly an interest into a search query rises and falls. And also like how Reddit discussions, for example, evolve over time. But we even went outside, offline, so to say, and we looked at how authors in Google Books data set, like the digitalized books, how they use certain terms. And we looked at how movie tickets are sold. And we saw that also here, also saw these accelerating dynamics.
We can blame at least some of this acceleration on the devices we use to access information today.
We did hypothesize that this has something to do with technological process because, our information systems become faster. We have push notifications. We have basically access to news 24 hours. These are the drivers. And the consequences, like what does it do to the quality of the discourse, for example? This is something that I'm still researching. But obviously, you could think that the quicker those turnovers are, the more difficult it is to keep up for example, journalism. Because they have to do their research and that usually takes some time. But if there's this very brief wave of interest and you have to catch that, you probably are better off by just publishing something that you have on the topic, which is maybe not that of a high quality. And by that, we are back at this vicious cycle where we have to keep up with this, but at the same time, we might do this to the detriment of some other qualities like the depth of the discourse, for example. Long, complicated content, of course, needs more resources and we need more time to read through it and understand it. And if there's a simple claim saying it's their fault or I solved the problem, stuff like that, that is something that, is easier to process. So maybe we attend to it more easily.
This makes sense given everything we know about human cognition. Like Jason said, our brains generally don't like working too hard, even though that effort is important for deep learning. He explained more.
Many of the things that we need to understand in the world are complicated. They just are. There's no avoiding that in almost all circumstances, not all, but the majority of circumstances. Learning those things requires effort. The problem that we have, and I like to draw the analogy between our minds and our bodies, because in many ways, if you want to get fit, similarly, you have to put in hard work. We don't necessarily see the muscles of our brains or, our body fat percentage decrease in our head in the same way that we can see those effects in a really concrete way in our body. So it can feel really tempting for us to just get to the finish line and not realize that just getting there was not the point of the exercise. It was the process that you go through in that learning, the hard work that takes you from point A to point B in your learning that is actually the key piece. It's not just about getting to the end result here. You have to invest the effort in order for that to be an effective learning experience. If you can find a way to shortcut that, that feels like you're getting to the end result without doing that work, that's a really tempting thing for a lot of people. So something that we've seen a lot, and this was particularly true when we started to use multimedia resources for learning, things like videos and podcasts, videos in particular, is that the more kind of fluent and easy to process the information is, and video is fantastic for this because you can create amazing animations and talk through things in a sort of slow and kind of considered way. Students can rewind things if they need to go over something again. And this gives us a feeling that the information is sometimes easier to process than it should be. So to give you a really clear example of this, you might have seen some of those really fancy documentaries that are produced sometimes about really complex ideas like cosmology or quantum physics. And because they're so beautifully made, at the end of watching that for an hour, you sort of feel like, oh, I completely understand quantum physics now. Of course you don't. But because there is something about the way in which the information is so easily processed, because it's entertaining, it's beautiful to look at, it's presented very well, it lures us into being overconfident about how much we know.
And this overconfidence can create a mismatch between what we think we know and what we actually know.
At any time we're learning something, it's always happening on two levels. On one level is the actual stuff that we're learning, right? The pure, if you like, cognitive component of it, which is I'm acquiring this knowledge, I'm figuring out this new way to use this information, whatever that might be, whatever the task is or whatever the learning is. Running alongside that always is another level, which is the way that we monitor and understand our own learning as it's happening. It doesn't just happen as an automatic process. We're constantly monitoring how we're going. And then on the basis of that monitoring, we make decisions about where we go to next. So we would call these processes broadly metacognitive or thinking about our thinking, if you like. The whole cycle, we refer in the research to this notion of self-regulated learning. And it does involve these critical components of making judgments about what I know relative to what I need to know, understanding where I need to go in terms of my goal setting, but also being able to make good decisions about what do I do next on the basis of where I think I am relative to where I need to be.
We'll be right back.
I4 2025 registration is now open. Be among the first to register for I4 2025, Sigma Xi's annual conference featuring award-winning research presentations, keynote speakers, and panels. This year's virtual format offers an international conference experience at affordable rates with no travel required. Visit www.experiencei4.org to learn more and register today.
You're listening to Wired for this. But having access to near infinite information all the time via the supercomputers we carry in our pockets and our backpacks can trick our brains into thinking we know more than we really do. Jason said that can be a problem.
Now, because technology lures us into thinking that we can get to the finish line faster, what tends to happen over time is that these misjudgments kind of compound. And that is that I think I understand this thing better than I actually do. As a result of that, I'm not making the best decision about what I do next. So to give you one example, I've just watched a very beautiful video that's explained quantum physics to me in an hour. At the end of that, my judgment is I understand quantum physics now. My decision is I don't need to study that anymore. So for students, that's a really important decision that they're making. I'm going to spend time with my friends. I'm going to take on some additional work. Whereas that misjudgment is leading them to make the wrong decision when they probably need to decide to actually spend more time studying the material because they've developed a level of overconfidence, which is the misjudgment here. That's the trap here, and this becomes a bit of a cycle.
There is a way to break the cycle.
In our research studies, we test people's knowledge. So we use a sort of classic testing kind of approach to see where their understanding is at. But we also ask people how confident are they, how much effort did they feel they needed to put into something, and how difficult they thought the material was. Somebody who doesn't perform very well on a test, feels very confident, didn't feel like they needed to put in much effort, and didn't really feel that material was difficult. It's very clear that that person is overconfident in their learning. I think the trick for us all as individuals and for teachers is that it's really about taking whatever opportunity we can to test our own understanding in a meaningful way, or to help our students to test their understanding in a meaningful way. So, for example, one way that we can do this as individuals is if I think I understand something, try and explain it to somebody else. And if you can't explain it to somebody else in a way that makes sense to them, you probably don't understand it quite well enough. And this is sort of classic work that people call the testing effect. Until you actually test your level of understanding in some way, whether that's through an exam or through having a conversation with somebody else and trying to explain it to them, it's really hard to get a good grasp on your level of understanding. But that calibration is critical. If we think about the end result of a lot of these processes to create people who have expertise, then what is an expert? An expert is not just somebody who knows lots of things. It's somebody who also knows the limits of their knowledge and and is well calibrated in terms of what they know and what they don't know. So that, I think, is the journey that we probably all want to go on.
We've alluded to it already, but digital technology is fundamentally changing how we take in and process information. This is a relatively new field of research, but scientists like Jason have already made some surprising observations.
Our brains are essentially doing the same sorts of tasks and activities that they were previously. What I think obviously has changed is that the vehicle by which information comes to us and the volume of information that comes to us has changed significantly. And some of the ways in which the information is packaged, I think, are creating some issues with the way in which we're making sense of information that we come across. What tends to happen is that, and this was true, pretty much since the internet became available, is that when we process the information from a screen, we often will do it in such a way that we're searching for something. And we see this in eye tracking studies where people's eye gaze goes to on a screen. And it will often follow a pattern that aligns with the sort of navigation functions that we use to work our way around that digital environment. And this is very different to the sorts of patterns that you see if somebody is, for example, reading something from a physical book or a piece of paper, in which people tend to be much more linear in their approach to reading it. What has happened, though, we've got some very recent data on this, which is very interesting and slightly scary, is that for young people in particular, so we're doing a lot of this work with secondary school, high school students, a lot of the behaviour we were previously seeing in digital environments, this sort of scanning and searching behaviour, is now translating over to the way that they're also processing information from hard books, from physical resources. So it's kind of scary that some of this processing is translating across, because we also know from the research that we've done is that you don't necessarily process the information as deeply when you're scanning and searching through it, as opposed to working through it in a very linear way as though you're kind of reading the material properly. So there's some serious risks there on one side. On the other side, it also generally means when we work from screens, as many of us have gotten used to, we become quite good at being able to synthesize different pieces of information and pull those things together in ways that you don't necessarily get from reading something in a sort of linear way from a physical resource. So there's a sort of upside and a downside to that. But I think the data that we've got would suggest that the The downsides at this point are sort of are winning. That, this surface level processing of stuff, even on paper, is starting to become a real problem.
All of this starts to get weirder when we consider our relationships with generative AI.
Generative AI has kind of taken this and really expanded on the way that these technologies allow us to have a kind of fluent interaction with them. Because while it's still a tool, it feels like a collaborator, right? It's not a collaborator, but it feels like a collaborator. And we know that because, and I ask this of people all the time, do you feel like you need to, or do you say please and thank you to generative AI? And the majority of people say that they do. But do you say please and thank you to a calculator? Or do you say please and thank you to your car? Your car's got 40 computers in it. There's something about this technology that makes it feel like we're collaborating with something. So what that then does is it takes this kind of fluency, because generative AI is also really good at explaining things. Sometimes it explains the wrong things in the wrong ways. It makes mistakes. But there's something about that fluency that comes from generative AI that particularly seems to be driving people to feel like they understand something better than they do. It does such a great job of explaining things, but perhaps it does too good a job. We're starting to see these sort of clear differentiations in terms of thresholds of use that we've been talking about. So the first one is just getting in and using these tools at all, right? Just getting in there and testing them out and, seeing what a prompt does and all that sort of thing. The second level is where you, and we see this with students in some of our studies, they're treating this technology like previous technologies. So something like a calculator or a search engine, they put something in, they expect a response from it, and then off they go. So it's very transactional. When people pass that threshold into the way in which these tools have been designed to be much more interactive, it then feels much more like a conversation. And I think that's where we start to really see some of this fluency impact on the way that people are processing that information.
Even though it sometimes feels like our devices control us, we do have some agency here. We can be intentional about building better information ecosystems for ourselves, on our phones and within our social networks. I asked Philipp for his advice.
I think many people say that they are not particularly happy with their information consumption. They say they're on their phones too much, or they mindlessly scroll through things and so on. And sure, you can try to practice self-control and stuff like that. But I think this is putting a bit too much responsibility on the individual, because we are facing a technological system that is trying to get our attention, as you already said, the algorithms of platforms, but also people who produce content. Obviously, they do this very intentional. And in that sense, I think I would rather focus on that part. Some of these biases, some of these tendencies are probably very old and somehow deeply ingrained in our psychology, as they are evolutionary. We can't just easily change that. We can just not tell ourselves, I just don't look at negative information anymore and ignore that and just look at the positive stuff. I think that wouldn't really work. And the problem is that these platforms with their algorithms, for example, they have, by learning about what we engage with, of course, learned our biases very well, and now they amplify them even further. And then, of course, this can also do something to us because we see more of that content and then we get engaged more with this. So we have some kind of feedback loop going on here. And yes, I think we have to break those feedback loops in one way or another. I do think that we need to have a bit of a societal conversation about what kind of information environment do we want to have, because these things are also human-made, right? The algorithms, the platforms, the technology that drives our information environment now is not like a force of nature. It's something that people developed, and then people can also change it. So I think we should tackle these parts.
So if the goal is to build better online platforms, we should have a clear idea of what better looks like. So I asked Philipp.
If I would think about the ideal information environment, I would think about an information environment that is less driven commercially. I think many of the big platforms, they have a commercial interest, and we kind of moved into this advertisement-driven business model on the internet mostly. And I think this is actually the root cause of some of the things we are seeing. Because there, in the advertisement business, it's quantity before quality. It's better to show a lot of ads to the customers and to keep them on their screen for longer. But these are maybe values that are even in contradiction with values that we want as a society for our public discourse, which might be information quality or time well spent or, constructive interactions with others. And these are all not really goals that are baked into those systems. And I do think we have to bring them back in.
One thing that can make public discourse feel biased, polarized, or hostile is our tendency to connect with people who already share our values.
That is something we can easily find online, and we find this all the time. And of course, this can lead to the fact that you're surrounding yourself with specific voices that, for example, are echoing quite literally your positions. And by that, you become less understanding of the other political side, for example. So, of course, the intuitive suggestion would be to then just follow some people from the other political side, even though it's not that simple, because actually some results show that it might have the opposite effect, that you then even get repulsed from that side either. So I don't think that we already know enough about those dynamics to make very concrete suggestions. I want to emphasize that also here, the power in shaping our own information environment is slightly limited, and it's actually getting reduced with time. If you think about platforms like TikTok, the social network element is becoming less important with time, because they are much more focused on the for you algorithm, they call, right? So the algorithm that actually decides for you.
Before we wrapped up, I asked Philipp what he would change about how we share information online.
I think the first thing I would do is to make the algorithms transparent. And this would give possibly users back some more control, because they might say, okay, this algorithm, I don't like that algorithm. It shows me all of these things. Maybe I can change it, or I switch platform. But if we don't know what the algorithm is actually doing, we don't have the possibility to make those decisions. And then also on the societal level, I think opening up the algorithms would help, for example, researchers like us to understand what are the dynamics. Why is the algorithm choosing certain content? Is it actually the psychological biases that are amplified? And once we cracked open the black box, then we can start talking about how we want to redesign it.
Thanks again to Jason Lodge and Philipp Lorenz-Spreen for joining in on this episode of Wired for This. You can find links to our sources in the episode description. You've been listening to a podcast by American Scientist, published by Sigma Xi, the Scientific Honor Society. Wired for This is produced and edited by Nabata Inani and hosted by me, Celia Ford. Thanks for listening.